Watch Harrisburg School District's financial update and proposed final budget presentation. Learn how our school district is allocating funds and resources to support the innovative teaching and learning of our students.
We're going to start with our first presentation, which is a preliminary final budget presentation. Mr. George Longridge, our business administrator, will walk us through the 21-22 preliminary budget presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Selmer. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Dr. Samuels. Tonight is really the final home stretch of our budget process, and I'd like to present a sort of an overview of where we are with this current year's fiscal situation before we get into the budget for next year, because I think we have to talk a little bit about how things are shaping up here at the end of our current year before we can, that sort of sets the table for how things are looking for the next year. Next slide, please. We'll have an update on that, and then we'll talk a little bit about next year's budget. There's quite a bit of information I'd like to present to everyone about the SR funds. This is that substantial amount of funding from the federal government that's coming to the district, and I have some information about that. That's quite important. And then we'll talk about the timeline going forward until the end of the fiscal year. And then Mr. Selmer has some comments on how we need to do some additional finishing on some of these details, and we'll end with any questions from anybody. So next slide. Our current situation as of the end of April, we're in very good shape. As you can see here, we're tracking on budget, our revenue and expense, our budget to actual, they're tracking pretty closely together, and we're in very good shape, especially on the expense side. Most of our expenses are incurred already through the year. We have some salaries and benefits that will be paid over the summer, and we'll accrue those in June. But for the most part, we're in fairly good shape here as we're entering the last 2 months of the fiscal year. Next slide. A couple of overall points in our revenue and our expense categories. For revenue, our fiscal year continues to trend positively. Talked about this in the last few months. Our local taxes, we're cautiously optimistic. We continue that optimism, especially regarding EIT, earned income tax, and our property tax projections. They're above where we thought they would be. However, our interest earnings, as we've started to replace and slowly rebuild our fund balance, because our interest rates are so low, we're not really gaining the benefit there. So that's a little bit of a disadvantage, and we're not gaining the interest like we would have in a normal interest rate environment. For state revenues, we're on budget. We're not expecting any surprises. We're submitting all of our reimbursement for our debt service, and that should be coming in. There was a little bit of a wrinkle thrown at us by the state. They announced that they didn't have enough of a budget allocation at the state level, so we might have to wait for some of those funds to come in, but that's something that I'm sure we'll get eventually. We just won't get it in a timely manner like we normally do. So they've got to do some work at the state level to get that additional budget complement to provide to school districts. I think that's probably a function of interest rates being low and a lot of districts going out and applying for refunding, and that generating some additional activity in the plan process. And at the federal level, the administration and my team, we've been hard at work working with Mr. Selmer and the other administrators on finalizing our details on the ESSER plan. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit. Also related to federal funding, the title funds for 2021, 2022 have not yet been released. And we're waiting for those. The budget numbers that I'll present to you here in a few moments are based on the current year. So we know that they're very conservative right now. We expect those to be increased from where we're at in this current fiscal year. On the expense side, as I said, we're trending positively. We're expecting another surplus this year. We won't know for probably another 4 weeks on exactly how large that'll be, but our salaries and benefits are on trend and on budget. We do have some open positions, so we'll expect some savings there. One area where we are seeing some less positive news is in charter schools. Enrollments are up. We're over budget in those areas, and that's really expected because of the pandemic and COVID. We've had some enrollments up there, and we expect to see some other negative experience in the coming fiscal year as well because of the new charter school that was approved. So we'll address that in the upcoming budget year as well. But that's something that we're going to continue to focus on as a cost savings area. We'll try to use HVLA to address that, but again, it's an area of focus. Our federal programs, they're below budget due to COVID. We haven't had the same focus on those programs because of students not being in school, in-person learning. They've been in school remotely, but not in the present. So we have some open positions there. We're going to be revising our budgets, and we'll have some additional carryover dollars. We'll work with our team to make sure that those budgets are revised, and we'll carry those dollars forward in the next fiscal year. And then finally, our capital and facility budgets are being utilized to upgrade our facilities and make sure that the facilities are appropriate for welcoming students back. Our youngest learners are coming back, and we're able to have good, safe, clean learning environments, and we're building some capacity for nice, clean airspace. We'll make sure that those ESSER dollars are utilized for those purposes as well. We'll have more details next month on that as we finalize those details. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the next budget, some of those details on that. So that's where we are on our expense right now for the current fiscal year. We're in pretty good shape with our expenses. Next slide, please. Tonight, we'll be talking about the proposed final budget for 2021-2022. And the numbers that I'll present tonight, there will be changes between now and when we ask Dr. Samuels to adopt the proposed the actual final budget in June. We have, as I mentioned a little bit ago, we have some areas of uncertainty. Mr. Summers mentioned we have some ongoing negotiations with our teachers union, with AFSCME. We also are still determining what the impact will be for charter schools. We've built some assumptions in, but as I said, right now they are assumptions. We don't know what the final details are. We're pretty confident in what those assumptions are, but we'll know better, hopefully, in a month or so where we are more definitively. The budget has no property tax increase for 2021-2022. That's, I think, a big win for taxpayers. It's something in such a difficult year that we're just coming through. It's important to make sure that we understand and let taxpayers understand that we understand how difficult this past year has been. However, as the fiscal officer for the school district, I think it's imperative that I emphasize this is not sustainable. The school district cannot continue to proceed without making adjustments to the property tax rate. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. There's some additional concerns in this area, specifically around federal funds, state funds, and how those have been manipulated in the past. And it's created a situation that I like to call a fiscal cliff. There has to be a conversation about this and how this situation has actually adversely affected a district like Harrisburg. We'll talk about Harrisburg specifically, of course, but that situation has really exacerbated some of the learning issues and some of the the fiscal issues here in the school district, and we want to avoid those in the future at all costs. In our budget, next slide, please. In our budget presentation tonight, we'll talk about the local taxes, and just for everyone's information now, local property taxes have a challenging environment. There's no doubt about it this year. People have had a hard time with their employment, had a hard time paying their bills. Businesses have really struggled. We know that, as I mentioned, this cliff that has come out in the past, in 2009, 2010, is something that we want to avoid. We want to do whatever we can to avoid this cliff in the future. Now that we have these ESSER dollars, we don't want to fund ongoing permanent positions with these ESSER dollars. What we want to do strategically is to try to fund short-term projects or construction projects or something that would be addressing a need that would be a permanent situation where we could address it and improve something for a longer term, but it wouldn't be an ongoing cost, and that would give us a chance to build some capacity into the budget to build some maintenance dollars long term. We want to ensure minimal disruption for our educational process and our students once the funding expires, because this funding will expire in different times, but the bulk of the funding expires in September of 2024. And then, of course, with local property taxes, we want to be, as I mentioned, sensitive, and we want to respect our local taxpayers. Some of the assumptions we've built into our budget as we presented it, or Dr. Samuel's review and approval tonight. We've tried to be a little bit more optimistic and positive about local taxes. We've been a little bit more aggressive in some of the carry forward and some of the projections specifically around EIT, some of the business taxes. I've consulted with some of our neighbors at the city offices in what they're projecting in some of those areas, and those numbers are reflected in the projections we've provided. For state funding, this is, I think, an important caveat, and this is something I think everyone needs to understand. What we are hearing at the administrative level is we're expecting a 0% increase in basic education funding and special education funding from the Commonwealth. That assumption is based in the understanding from the state legislators that because we're getting this ESSER funding, they feel we shouldn't really be in a position to expect state funding in basic ed and special ed. They could change their minds, but the latest information we have is that we should not expect increases to our line items in those two categories. That's a pretty big category for Harrisburg, those two line items. We get a significant amount of our funding in those two lines. And as I mentioned, we haven't yet built in any sort of increase in our federal allocations for title funding. So that's something we'll review once we get those allocations. For our salaries and expenses that are the bulk of our budget, I think everyone here knows salary benefits comprise over half of our budget. Those are still being determined. We have ongoing negotiations. We've factored in a 2% increase for many of the other categories in contracts where we know where we have a fixed cost for a contract for a service or something like that. We've attached a figure to those. And then charter schools, we anticipate a large increase in those categories, specifically the PA STEAM charter school that was just recently approved. We expect a large increase in charter school numbers for that. Overall, and Mr. Selmer alluded to this in some of his comments in previous meetings, we've really tried to hold the line in our spending, but we're looking at a 0.5% increase in our overall spending before we account for any sort of ESSER spending. We wanted to take the same approach in this year's budget, the same type of approach that we took last year with COVID impacts. We wanted to say, what does our budget look like if we don't consider any sort of ESSER funding? And then what we do is we factor in the ESSER funding. Well, we did the same thing last year with COVID. We said, what does the pre-COVID budget look like, and then what does it look like after COVID? So we try to take the same type of approach. Before you factor in anything to do with ESSER, we're almost a flat budget. And I think our team's done a very good job of controlling costs, really trying to stay on top of any of the increases, be very good fiscal stewards here in the district. And then we're also trying to budget for a full complement of staff, which is very difficult. Ms. Lewis has done a good job in HR trying to get good quality candidates to teach our students, but it's a very competitive environment out there. There are lots of people, lots of school districts after a very small pool of teachers. It's very competitive right now. So next slide, please. So to give you the top level summary for the budget, we're looking at a proposed budget revenue of just over $153 million, and our expense is just over $159 million. The COVID rules, or excuse me, the ESSER rules for ESSER funding allow us to use some of this funding for continuing operations. So we're proposing to use $5.6 million of this ESSER funding to close this gap this year. It wouldn't be using any of our fund balance. It would be using this ESSER funding. Without the ESSER funding, we'd have a budget deficit of $5.6 million. But again, this does not include any sort of tax increase. Next slide, please. To give you a breakdown of our different categories, our salaries and benefits and contracted services, you'll see here. This is how it breaks down. We've really tried to hold the line on where some of these categories are falling. To simplify things, we tried to project where these categories will come out at the end of this year. There's not a budget to budget because I don't think that's really appropriate. Share some of the spending that we did not is on hold because of the COVID situation. That's not really a realistic scenario. Once we go back to a normal environment, we'll start to make those types of investments in our learners, and it wouldn't really be appropriate to look at that right now because we're not spending those dollars, but we will spend them in the future. So we're looking at this this spending plan right now. We're projecting here, and you see our proposed column, and that's why it's significantly higher than what we're projecting, because we're proposing at a full complement, and we're proposing under normal environment of our spending plan. So I went through that very quickly, and what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more about, next slide, please. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the CARES and ESSER funding. This law, this act was passed back in the early days of the pandemic. And it was in the spring of 2020 where the school district received our first allocation, first dose of our allocation of $4.7 million of funding. In the time since then, we've received two other allocations, and we call them, just for lack of better terms, SR1, SR2, and SR3. This is one-time funding for the school district. It's not an ongoing revenue stream. It's not something that we can rely upon many years into the future. It's one-time funding, and it expires on September 30th of 2024. So that means we have approximately 42 months, or almost 3.5 years, to appropriately spend $83 million. Now, I say appropriately because that's a key word. We have to comply with many different purchasing regulations, academic regulations, and I won't talk about all those tonight. Frankly, I'm not the right person to talk about the academic side. I could talk about the purchasing regulations, but in future meetings, we can talk about all the other compliance pieces regarding academics. And Mr. Selmer and Dr. Sneath and Dr. Mameen would be better versed in doing those types of things. The point I would like to make is that there are a lot of legal purchasing and procurement requirements we need to meet and to meet the mandates in order to appropriately spend these funds. The folks from PDE have made it very clear to us that they will be monitoring us during and after this window, and we need to make sure that we have everything appropriately documented and appropriately documented, I guess is the right term, so that when this window closes, we can demonstrate to them that we handle these funds appropriately. So there's a lot of work that's being done now to make sure that we are ready for that examination once these funds are expended. The thing about these funds is it's really a generational opportunity for our school district, our programs, our facilities, and our academics to address critical needs in Harrisburg School District. Before we get to some of those details, though, I think it's really important to take a step back and review past circumstances, because some of the things that have occurred in the past are very similar to what's happening today. There's a concern that we have in our team that what is happening today could happen again based on what's happened in the past. And we need to make sure that we plan appropriately now so we can avoid some of those challenges that have occurred in the past. Next slide, please. So you might think, why is it important to look back on what happened in the past? And the window I'd like to look back through is about 10 years ago. Some of you might remember, if you were on the board back then, or if you were involved in school board business or in academics at all, you might remember a lot of the terminology I'm about to use. I think we all remember the economy at that time. We went through a pretty tough time. Right around that time is when the government used another fiscal stimulus called ERA dollars. The ESSER funds are a great windfall for the district, but it has a potential to set up a fiscal cliff for us, and it's a big one. And a fiscal cliff is a situation that could set up some big funding gaps for the school district. And when these funding gaps occur, if they're not planned for appropriately, they could lead to layoffs, program cuts, other significant hardships for a school district. And we ask ourselves administratively, what can we do now to lessen or avoid those fiscal cliff problems? The bigger your funding, the bigger the potential cliff. So we still want to rebuild our academic programs and social programs for our students, but we want to avoid the cliff so we avoid the pain in the future. So let's take a look back. The next slide, please. So the window back is to 2007, 2008, and the Great Recession. That's when it started with Lehman Brothers, the meltdown of their investment bank, the housing meltdown. You might remember the subprime debacle where we had all of those issues with real estate. There was a significant economic disruption and job loss. Right at the end of that, we had the election of a new president. We had Barack Obama elected as our president. Next slide. One of the first things that President Obama did with Congress was he came in and he passed a law and a bill with economic and fiscal stimulus. It was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, ERA. And there were a lot of components in ERA, but one of the things that it addressed, and what we'll talk about tonight, is funding for education. And these dollars went to states, and they went directly to departments of education at states. And these dollars were to be used for teacher salaries, they were to be used for educational programs, school facilities, construction. Does it sound familiar? It should, because that's what a lot of the ESSER dollars are supposed to be used for today. Now, Pennsylvania distributed those ERA funds to schools starting in the 2009-2010 budget year. Keep that in mind. That's very important. So on this next slide, what I'd like you to see is this is a chart showing from 2007 to 2014 local funding in Harrisburg School District. You'll see In 2007, things looked okay. 2008, things were actually a little bit better. And then 2009, they dipped down. You'll see the red circle there shows how the effect of the recession started to adversely affect revenues, but they started to tick back up. Now, I didn't dig in deeply enough to see whether that's because there was a tax increase or whether the economy really bounced back. The point of this slide is there wasn't a lot of change in local revenue during this time. There was a drop. You would expect that during a recession. It's just normal, but it wasn't a dramatic drop. You saw that it went from almost $50 million down to about 47 million here in 2008. So that's what you'd normally expect to see during a recession. And then it bounced back in future years. In 2012, it was back to about what it normally was. Next slide, please. The next slide is federal funding. You'll see the same time period, 2007 to 2014. 10, which is the 2009-2010 fiscal year that I mentioned, that's when Harrisburg got their distribution of ERA dollars, okay? Huge influx of federal money. The ERA funding came in during the 2009-2010 school year, and then it also went over into 2010-2011. The funding was pretty substantial, okay? But you see, starting in the 2012 school year, there was a significant drop. That's because that short-term fiscal stimulus, it was designed only to be short-term, and then it went away. So that's what the blue arrow represents. It reverted back down to what it had been, roughly speaking, before the stimulus started. So the funding was reduced from $18.7 million to $10.9 million. So that's almost $8 million of reduction in federal spending. Just keep that in mind, because the next slide is something I think is really the point that is critically important here for us to understand the fiscal cliff. This is state funding, the same time period. And what's critically important here is the state funding during the same time period was reduced by $12.8 million. From the time the fiscal stimulus started with the federal government to the time the federal government stopped their ERA distributions in 2012, the district lost $12.8 million of funding, okay? It was reduced because the state government said, look, you're getting this federal funding, you don't need the state funding anymore. They supplanted it. That's the terminology we use in school finance, supplanting. You get the state funding, you don't need the federal, or you get the federal funding, you don't need the state funding. They took it away. And when the economy started to recover, they never put the state funding back. So we had that gap, or the fiscal cliff. That's why this is so important. It's really important that everybody understands this, because on this next slide, please, you'll see it shows, we put it all together, your overall funding level in 2012 dropped significantly, okay? You put it all together. In 2008, you were over $130 million. In 2012, you were down closer to $120 million. That is very significant, and that loss came from supplanting and revenue loss from the Commonwealth. I wanted to spend a few minutes on this because it's critically important for everyone to understand what's going to happen if we're not very careful. The state's having their own budget challenges as well. I mean, they have to rely on revenue from taxpayers and everything. So I'm not trying to blame them. I'm trying to illustrate what happened in the past, and there's a chance it could happen in the future if we're not careful and manage this process very carefully as we go forward. So next slide. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more about the details of ESSER and what is allowed and what is not allowed. I know some people might be interested in what could be allowed to be done with some of these ESSER dollars. The information I'm about to share has been gathered from PASBO, which is the statewide business manager group. They put on some informational sessions, and they were kind enough to allow us to use this information to share with the public and with school boards. So this is from them. You'll see their logo on all the slides, and I think it's pretty good information. I won't read all of the slides because there are a lot of words on these slides, but I think you'll get the information, and I'll just sort of paraphrase a lot of what's on here. Next slide, please. So the uses of the funds, they essentially allow for a lot of the activities that were allowed by anything that's provided by federal law, anything that has to do with any of the educational agencies in the government, state government, federal government, anything to do with disabilities, language learning, anything to do with students experiencing homelessness, foster care, outreach to meet those needs. So those are very big, high-level needs that we're already meeting those needs or addressing those needs with some of the programs that we have in this district. We're allowed to fund those efforts with some of these dollars. Next slide, please. Some of these items are things that we're doing to improve our systems internally, internal procedures and systems, training, purchasing supplies for sanitation and clean facilities, planning and coordinating and implementing activities for long-term closures. Some of these things might not be applicable to a certain school district. Here in Harrisburg, some of these things would definitely be applicable. Supplies for cleaning and sanitizing. We've talked about potentially some of the HVAC systems, some of the additional cleaning that we would want to do for some of our facilities. That's what we did in the early days with some of the SR funds that we got in the first batch of funding that we got. So this is exactly what we did early on with some of these. Next slide, please. Purchasing technology, purchasing student services and supports, anything to do with summer learning to after school programs, providing classroom instruction for online learning, anything to do to support learning for students that have fallen behind or experienced a difficulty in getting through the pandemic. Those types of initiatives are supported with these funds. Next slide. This is a critical one, addressing learning loss among students, including low-income students, children with learners. This is something that's directly called out in one of the provisions of SR3. I'll talk about this in a little bit. We have to allocate a certain percentage of SR3 dollars for learning loss, and that's about $10.5 million. I have a slide devoted to this, but SR3 specifically mentions learning loss and a certain percentage that we have to set aside for the students. Next slide, please. School facility repair and improvements, inspection testing, indoor air quality, developing strategy for health protocols. All of those things are more tied up with facilities, and we definitely have some ideas and some plans for spending some funds on those. R is highlighted because this is what we're proposing to spend to close our budget gap this year. Other activities are necessary to maintain the operation and continuity of service in a local educational agency to continue ongoing operations. So that's a sort of a very good flexible provision to allow school districts to continue their operations given certain revenue shortfalls or a hardship that they might encounter due to COVID. Here's a slide about SR3. This was what I was mentioning earlier. SR3 funds, they're generally the same as they are for SR1 and SR2, but we have to set a minimum of 20% of our funds to address learning loss. And that's set aside for us. Here's the number right here, $10,597,000. We will have more detailed plans on how to spend those dollars when we come to the board and to Dr. Samuels in June at the budget update meeting on the 14th, and then for final approval on the 21st. PASBO made some recommendations on best practices for using these dollars. I'll mention some of them. Some of them aren't applicable to Harrisburg, but offsetting general expenditures whenever you can. Don't forego property tax increases if you need them. Build some fund balance to address. Talk a little bit about how dramatic that could be given what's happened in the past. And then do some advanced purchasing to try to build things in advance, build some capacity, build some surplus in certain items if you can. And then return on investment projects to lower future expenses, energy efficiency, cleanliness, get your technology leases or purchases lined up, those types of things. Those are all things that our administrative team are trying to get best bang for our buck with this generational opportunity for our students. The next slide shows our blueprint right now for how we are proposing to spend these dollars. And again, this is just a framework right now. This is something our team is modifying and tweaking as we go. This will undoubtedly change in the coming weeks, but this is the blueprint we're working off of right now. You'll see in the first year, we're proposing, the first year being 2021, 2022, we're looking to spend almost $22 million. And these are in three basic areas: academics, operations, and facilities. And the academic areas would be around social and emotional supports, summer instruction, academic acceleration, and so on and so forth. I won't read them all. You can see right there for yourself. Operation would be the continuity of operations, healthcare support, contracted services, supplies, buying things for our schools for cleaning and sanitation, support for our cafeteria. We've supported the community and supported our students with meals. We need to support our cafeteria because they're going to cost of those types of things. So all of these are activities that are allowed by the rules that we see for ESSER. Next slide, please. You'll see I tried to create a sort of a little calendar that shows you a layout of how the ESSER spending timeline looks. Because when I say September 2024, it sounds like, oh, wow, that sounds like it's way in the distance, but it's really not that far away. We're right here in the end of fiscal year 2021, and we only have a few more budget cycles to go before we have to have these funds expended and accounted for. So it's really a matter of we've already spent some of this money because we could have started allocating it starting last March, and we did that. But the rest of these money, and we have most of the money still to be spent, but most of this is to be planned for in the next 2 to 3 budget cycles. And we have to have it fully spent by that last arrow, which is the fiscal year 24-25, but it has to be spent by September of that year. So it's really the first quarter of that budget cycle. So I spent a lot of time on ESSER. I think it's, next slide, please. I spent a lot of time on ESSER. I think it was important to do that so everyone understood. This is a high-level summary of the budget that we're proposing tonight, Dr. Samuels. You'll see our revenue number, the $153 million. Our expenditure is just over $159 million. Our funding gap is being, we're proposing to fill it with some ESSER dollars, $5.6 million. Down here on the bottom, We're proposing these buckets, so to speak, of ESSER funds to be used for the continuity of education, COVID, technology, contracted services, COVID supplies and testing, academic, so on and so forth. And then down here under facilities, we're proposing $2.5 million towards the initial phase of HVAC upgrades and some construction planning. So that would be the entire $21.9 million. And in the PDE 21 or PDE 2028, excuse me, that is broken out separately. And you'll see that in the document tonight when I review that at the appropriate time. Again, these ESSER plans are tentative, and we'll have more information in June with more detail, but we want to have it out for the public to see it today. Next slide has the next steps in the budget process, and at this point, I'll turn it over to Mr. Selmer because I know he has some comments.
Thank you, Mr. Longridge. Thank you for that comprehensive and detailed presentation this evening. I do have a couple comments based on your presentation before we go over the next steps. For the ESSER conversation that Mr. Longridge just walked us through, the administration will be seeking input on the ideas for the ESSER spending over the coming years. So for the public, you can expect more information and a way and mechanism to provide feedback on those ESSER plans. The surplus that was referenced earlier tonight that we're anticipating for this current budget year, those dollars are going to be needed to offset charter school costs. And as Mr. Longridge articulated, we had a significant increase in charter school costs. And our hope is that there's legislation that's being proposed to finally address the inequity of charter school funding, specifically for cyber schools. And so if this happens and this legislation essentially flattens the tuition rates the school district has to pay, that can help us with this gap that's being proposed tonight. So more now than ever, there's been a lot of discussion regarding charter school reform, and I'm hopeful our legislators step up and get this over the finish line once and for all, because it's totally unfair the way charter schools are funded to local public school districts and the taxpayers, specifically the cyber charter schools. And our families should know, on top of the increase that we're proposing that we have to pay, these same entities received ESSER funding like the school district did. And if you're a cyber charter school under COVID, you didn't have near the expenses that a brick and mortar operation had under COVID-19. So I am hopeful that finally something will be done to level the funding playing field between brick and mortar schools and charter schools. The underfunding piece that Mr. Lawrence referred to is problematic as far as reoccurring revenue. The information he shared this evening around the cliff, as he referred to, is real. Harrisburg has been underfunded for over 25 years as far as their basic ed funding. So if basic ed funding does not continue to rise during this time where we have one-time funding, there is going to be a hole in 24-25, and it may be significant depending on what happens. So we need to continue as a team and as a community to advocate for reoccurring funding for the Harrisburg School District. We are so appreciative of these one-time dollars, but they do not replace sustainable revenue within our budget long-term. And what could end up happening long-term is a significant tax increase to our taxpayers down the line if this gap isn't closed. So we need to keep our eye on that. And as an administration, we'll continue to update our community on those issues because they are significant concerns, as was outlined tonight. Mr. Longridge referred to the surplus and some of the positions during this current fiscal year. Because we were not in a brick and mortar setting, there were a number of supplemental support positions that we did not fill during this year. And I just want to make sure that was clear when that was referenced. As far as the ESSER funding being used for positions, one thing this administration is committed to is transparency. And in the future, if we propose additional positions that they have to be funded by ESSER dollars. You're going to see that on the board agenda, just like you've seen other ESSER funding source allocations in previous board agendas. We are going to be transparent because there needs to be an understanding at the end of this ESSER funding what decisions will need to be made, and they need to be transparent so people know in advance what positions we may propose actually funding to support our students during this transition back to our new world of learning as we come out of COVID-19. Last thing I want to mention is in the legislation in ESSER 2 and 3, and Mr. Longridge mentioned it appropriately and quoted it accurately, they use the phraseology learning loss. We're not going to be using that in the Harrisburg School District other than referencing these ESSER 2 and 3 funds. Our mode of operation is about academic acceleration and academic recovery. The word loss insinuates that you've lost something and you can't get it back. That's not the mode we're operating here in the school district. It has been a difficult year. We've had to stay remote for quite some time. But we also have students, and we've had things that have happened academically where we have thrived in some areas, and we're going to be able to take those lessons to help move students forward in this new learning model that comes out of COVID. But for our purposes, our march towards supporting our students, it's about academic acceleration and it's about recovery. It's not about loss, because we're not going to lose students through this process. We are going to, and to continue to support our students. If students are behind, which we do have students that are behind because of COVID-19, we are going to work to recover those students and get them to where they need to be. That's our commitment as an administration and as a school district, as a school board, and as a receiver. That is our vision over the next couple of years. It is not about loss, because again, loss insinuates you lost something that you cannot get back. And that's not how we're going to operate over the next couple of years. So I just want to make sure I mention that, but learning loss is the exact terminology in the ESSER funding, and that's how it's written in. So again, I want to thank Mr. Longridge for his presentation. The next steps of the budgetary process, June 14th, we're going to have a virtual workshop. So we'll provide updates to the work that's going to be done between tonight and June 14th as we prepare for June 21 budget adoption. So again, no tax increase. We have a balanced budget based on ESSER helping us to cover some of our revenue shortfall that we're projecting. And so there is some good news, but we have to continue to look long-term to make sure that we're sharing information and we're painting an accurate picture of what could potentially happen down the line. So again, thank you, Mr. Longridge. Thank you to our public for staying with us and listening and learning about our final budget, our preliminary final budget presentation.
This has been a presentation of the Harrisburg School District.